And welcome to another one of our episodes, Kiddy Talk. Today, we asked the kids if they knew who the wisest person in the Old Testament was. Let's go out and see what the kids had to say about that.
Who was the wisest man in the Old Testament?
Solomon.
Who was the wisest man in the Old Testament?
I think the wisest man in the Old Testament was St. Peter.
Who was the wisest man in the Old Testament?
Who was the wisest man in the Old Testament?
Jesus.
Who was the wisest man in the Old Testament?
Moses.
Who was the wisest man in the Old Testament?
I don't know.
Who was the wisest man in the Old Testament?
Santa Mom.
Who was the wisest man in the Old Testament?
King Sam.
Who was the wisest man in the Old Testament?
Moses.
Who was the wisest man in the Old Testament?
King Solomon.
Who was the wisest man in the Old Testament?
Who was the wisest man in the Old Testament?
Taking a guess, okay? Judas, I don't know.
Who was the wisest man in the Old Testament? Can you take a guess?
Moses.
Who was the wisest man in the Old Testament?
Moses.
So those were some pretty good answers that the kids had. A lot of kids actually thought that Moses was the wisest man in the Old Testament. Although Moses was a very wise man, he was not who we consider to be the wisest man in the Old Testament. The wisest man in the Old Testament is considered to be King Solomon. Now, King Solomon wasn't actually born very wise. He became wise because he prayed and he asked God for that. When he was anointed to be king, he prayed only for that. He said to God, I don't want anything else but to be wise so that I can serve you better and that I could lead your people to know you more and be a wise king for your people and for your sake. And God loved that so much, and so he promised him that he would be wiser than any man on earth. And that was true. King Solomon became very wise, and because he only asked for the wisdom, God also blessed him in many other things, in richness and in a lot of other things in his life. King Solomon actually wrote 3 books in the Bible. The first one was Proverbs. He also wrote Ecclesiastes, and he wrote the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon. And also he's said to have written 2 of the Psalms. I hope that you learned something new today about the wisest man in the Bible, who was King Solomon. Have a great day, and thanks for watching us on Kiddy Talk.